This is lesson 15.2, Absolutism in France and Spain. So what factors led to the rise of the French absolutist state? And why did absolutist Spain experience decline in the same period? So we're starting with College Board Topic 3.1, Contextualizing State Building. Explain how absolutist forms of rule affected social and political development from 1648 to 1815. That is our new period. That's period 2. And it says the new concept of the sovereign state and secular systems of law played a central role in the creation of new political institutions. Monarchies seeking enhanced power faced challenges from nobles who wished to retain traditional forms of shared governance and regional autonomy. And then we've got College Board Topic 3.4, Economic Development and this new thing called Mercantilism. Explain the continuities and changes, that's a historical thinking skill, in commercial and economic developments from 1648 to 1815. European states followed mercantilist policies by drawing resources from the colonies in the New World and elsewhere. Foreign lands provided raw materials, finished goods, laborers, and markets for the commercial and industrial enterprises in Europe. And I put the key words in bold on these statements. And then we've got College Board Topic 3.6, Balance of Power. Explain how European states attempted to establish and maintain a balance of power on the continent throughout the period from 1648 to 1815. And keep in mind, this goes all the way back to the Renaissance with balance of power theory. After 1648, dynastic and state interests, along with Europe's expanding colonial empires, influenced the diplomacy of the European states and frequently led to war. And Louis XIV's nearly continuous wars, pursuing both dynastic and state interests, provoked a coalition of European powers opposing him. And I think that's a reference to specifically the War of Spanish Succession. And so really concentrating on France at this point, and this is a time frame right here, 1589 to 1715. And we've got some key players, including Cardinal Richelieu. There's our buddy Henry IV. We also have another cardinal called Jules Mazerin. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, big hero for us, big financial guru. And, of course, Louis XIV. Some key concepts: mercantilism, Versailles, the Palace of Versailles, the French nobility, the Fronde, what was that? And then, of course, wars. So looking back before 1648, you're familiar with this. You had Henry IV, King of France. Kings ruled by the grace of God. This was a widely accepted legal precedent. And what it meant was that kings could claim exclusive power. Henry IV, who ruled from 1589 to 1610, whose story we know, that it comes from 1305, French Wars of Religion. This was the guy we already studied. He had been Henry of Navarre. He had been a Huguenot, which was a French Calvinist, and he had married the sister of the King of France, Henry III. And so the King Henry III, we know this story, then made Henry of Navarre the heir to his throne and then died. He was assassinated. And so Henry of Navarre became Henry IV and was the first Bourbon on the throne. Louis XIII and Louis XIV would be his son and grandson. He had inherited a country ruined by civil war, as we know. He had issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, and he rebuilt the country's ruined infrastructure. He lowered taxes, he made money by selling royal offices, and Henry himself was actually murdered in the year 1610. So then you had Louis XIII, and he ruled from 1610 to 1643. He married Anne of Austria, and you could see that he reigned almost throughout the entire 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War went from 1618 to 1648, so his reign covered much of that. And so Louis XIII preferred to let his ministers run the country for him. And one of the most effective ministers was Cardinal Richelieu, 1585 to 1642. So before 1648, there was Cardinal Richelieu, and Richelieu's foreign policy was this. As an inheritor of Louis XIII's dad's politique party, remember that, politique? He believed that the interests of the state outweighed religious considerations. In other words, this was also known as reason of state. And what this meant was weakening those Catholic Habsburg rulers of the Holy Roman Empire and supporting the Habsburgs' Protestant enemies, especially during the 30 Years' War. And it meant opposing his own church in Rome, of which he was a cardinal when necessary. Then we have Richelieu's domestic policy, increase royal control. That was his main goal. And one of the ways he did it was to use these intendants, district governors, in the 32 districts of France to help centralize power. Richelieu gave these royal commissioners wider powers, and he made them directly responsible to the crown. Then you've got Cardinal Jules Mazarin, 1602 to 1661, and he's a prime example of what happens when you go too far. You take Richelieu's domestic policies, go too far with them. Mazarin succeeded Richelieu as first minister, and that meant that he was running the country on behalf of the king. He served the child king Louis XIV beginning in 1643, and he worked closely with Louis's mother, the Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, and he continued Richelieu's centralizing policies, but then the Fronde happened, and now we are finally in period 2. The Fronde was a series of uprisings, riots, that lasted from 1648 to 1653. And the word Fronde actually means sling. And the reason it was called this was because the crowds actually used slings to break the windows of Mazarin's supporters. And the Fronde was the result of using heavy-handed measures to increase government revenue. And it got so bad, this Fronde, that Louis XIV, as a child, actually had to flee Paris. And this had a huge psychological impact on Louis. This is how the Fronde started. It began with the selling of all of these noble titles for revenue. That was all bound to have some kind of an effect on aristocratic society. Remember that selling titles to nobles was a main source of revenue for these kings. They got a lot of cash out of doing it, and they were able to bypass whatever representative assemblies that they had to bypass in order to get money. And so there were two main kinds of nobles now. You had nobles of the robe, and these were judges and administrators. There were about 1,100 of them in the various parlements, and these were courts of appeal. That's not parliament, that's parlement. Their positions were hereditary. Don't forget how previous kings raised revenue. And the most influential of all of these various parlements was the Parlement of Paris. Then you also had nobles of the sword. These were the older, knightly nobles whose families extended as far back as feudal times. They had not bought their titles from the crown. Right? They were long-standing nobles. It wasn't a situation where the king took their money and then put a robe on them and gave them a noble title. Their families had actually earned it. So the nobles of the robe at the Parlement of Paris were outraged by the crown's autocratic measures, and they actually stirred up rioting among the common people. And the violence spread to include not only the nobles of the robe, but also the nobles of the sword. So now everybody's against the crown. The result was a total breakdown of civil order. The violence got so bad that Louis XIV, like I said, had to flee Paris. And the rebellion died down when King Louis XIV took over in his own right in the year 1651. So Louis XIV and absolutism. Officially, Louis XIV ruled from 1643 to 1715, but he took over for real in 1651. The people were willing to accept a strong monarch after the upheaval and the trauma of the Fronde. Central power and authority reached its peak with Louis XIV, and we can truly call it an absolute monarchy, even though an absolute monarchy is never entirely absolute. And when Jules Mazarin died in the year 1661, Louis XIV simply did not replace him. Louis XIV was a devout Catholic. He was also deeply impacted by the Fronde, and he was determined that he should never be threatened by such a revolt again. Both his Catholicism and his fear of revolts combined to form his signature creed, which was this: one king, one law, one faith. That creed led him in just about every decision he made. So one king, one law, one faith, it summarized how Louis XIV would run France. He would be a very hands-on ruler rather than relying on a first minister. He didn't replace Jules Mazarin. He was going to be his own first minister. And he would actively dominate his nobles. He would be very independent of his nobles. And he would standardize France's very disparate legal system in 1667. And he would run just about all the non-Catholics out of France. Louis XIV believed in the divine right of kings, which we'll talk much about during this chapter. He took the title of the Sun King, and he ruled through several councils of state. He never once, not one single time in his entire career, called a meeting of the Estates General, which was France's national body of representatives. Then you have Bishop Jacques-Benin Bossuet, 1627 and 1704. He was a French bishop, and he was Louis XIV's court preacher. He was a brilliant speaker, and he was an important courtier and politician, and he was a tutor to Louis XIV's oldest son. And he was a relative latecomer to the divine right of kings debate. But Jean-Jacques Benin Bossuet saw government as inherently divine, of God, and from God. He argued this in his book, Politics Derived from the Very Words of Scripture, published in 1709 after he died. And Bossuet argued that the prince and the state were the same thing. Only public enemies saw a difference between the two. So if you see the prince as being in any way different from the state, you're a public enemy. Bossuet argued God establishes kings as his ministers and reigns through them over the people. So obedience to them was a matter of religion and conscience. Jean-Jacques Benin Bossuet did not believe that the king was above the law. Instead, he believed that kings must only use their power for the public good. And he argued that if a king were to break the law, then he destroyed the law by his bad example. You and me, we break the law, we break the law. But if the king breaks the law, then that has a destructive force upon the law. Louis XIV did not willingly share power. He selected his counselors from among the upper middle class and the recently ennobled. The old nobles, the nobles of the sword, he shut them out. And he forced his nobles to live part of the year with him at the palace of Versailles. He had no use for a first minister of France. He was his own first minister. He persecuted the Huguenots. He tried everything besides persecution to try to get the Huguenots to convert. Remember, right? One king, one law, one faith. He would give out cash payments. He'd pay you cash to convert to Catholicism. He banned Huguenots from government posts, and he billeted soldiers in their houses, all in an effort to get them to convert. So why did he do such a thing to the Huguenots? Louis XIV never felt that they could be loyal enough to him. What is he to the Huguenots? He's a hell-bound, reprobate Catholic monarch. Respect for authority was not a Calvinist trait. They believed they were above authority, especially if that authority was a Catholic. Many devout Catholics had Louis's attention, and remember Louis's credo: one king, one law, one faith. Finally, in 1685, Louis XIV issued the Edict of Fontainebleau to deal with all of these Calvinists. And this edict revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685. It referred to Calvinism as a false religion. The Edict of Nantes, if you'll remember, had been issued by his grandfather, Henry IV, way back in 1598, and it had protected Huguenots and kept the peace for 87 years. And as a result of the Edict of Fontainebleau, 200,000 of France's most highly skilled artisans fled France, took their skills and their knowledge and their energy and their experience elsewhere. Constraints for Louis XIV. There's a common misperception here. Louis XIV's absolute power was actually not quite as absolute as you would think. Louis XIV's divine appointment from God came with a downside. For one thing, he was expected to rule with virtue and benevolence. He was expected to uphold the laws that the kings who came before him had made. When the king dies, he never really dies. All the laws and all the edicts that he comes up with go on. And his successor is really obligated to maintain all of that. And Louis XIV had to rely on the nobles, who had a lot of local power still. This is a plan of the Palace of Schönbrunn, which was based on Louis XIV's Versailles. The palace at Versailles. Why Versailles? Why move his entire government there? And what was Versailles? Versailles was a little village about 10 miles outside of Paris, and the family had numerous palaces and residences all over France. And they had a hunting lodge actually in Versailles. Reasons for moving to Versailles. Well, Louis XIV didn't want to be vulnerable to these Parisian riots and revolts like the Fronde. Also, it was a way of keeping his nobles isolated from their means of support. And remember, he sees himself very much in competition with his nobles and needing to dominate his nobles. Louis XIV needed something big to house a large bureaucracy, and Versailles had lots of space for construction, and he moved there in 1682, but the construction continued all the way until 1710. Life at Versailles. Louis XIV moved the French court to Versailles in the year 1682, and he required all the nobles to live there for part of the year, and they had to obey in order to compete with each other for his favors and for goodies like, for example, government office, for military posts, for religious posts, for state pensions, for honorary titles, and many other favors that he could give them. Versailles was very crowded. There were anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 people there every day. Louis designed elaborate rituals of etiquette for every aspect of his life for his nobles to perform for him. You're the noble that gives me my hat today, and you're the noble that gives me my dressing gown today. And these nobles had to compete with each other to take part in these rituals. And being allowed to participate in these rituals meant that you had the king's favor. Women and the patronage system. What is patronage? This goes all the way back to the Renaissance. We talked about this with Renaissance art. But patronage is a system in which a higher ranked person protected a lower ranked person in exchange for loyalty and services. So it's a slightly different definition from what we had in the Renaissance. Patronage flowed out from Versailles out to the provinces, and women played a central role in Louis XIV's patronage system. Women such as the Queen, his mistresses, his female relatives, and various noble women. Why mix this elaborate system of etiquette rituals with this system of patronage? Well, Louis XIV controlled the distribution of state power and wealth. Our textbook says he gained cooperation from powerful nobles this way. But it was also a way to degrade and humiliate them. And it was a subtle way to express the loathing and the contempt that he felt towards them. You can see this picture right here. I mean, talk about humiliating. Here are these nobles. They're well-dressed. They're wealthy. They're landowners. They're used to telling other people what to do. And what are they doing? They're kneeling down in front of Louis XIV. Very humiliating. So Louis XIV was a huge patron of the arts of all kinds. And his support founded the movements of French Classicism, or you can also call it neo-Classicism. It possessed classical qualities, so that's why it took on that name. And it included paintings, sculptures, music, dance, theater, literature. He supported the playwright Molière, who wrote Tartuffe. 3 ways that Versailles increased the prestige of French culture. French courts around Europe started speaking French. And French became the language of polite society and diplomacy. There are 3 ways to fund huge armies that will centralize your power, solidify your sovereignty, provide security, and support your dreams of absolute power. You can raise lots and lots of taxes. People aren't going to like that very much. You can create and sell new government offices and new titles. The third thing you can do is you can practice a policy called mercantilism. Mercantilism brings lots of gold into your country, and gold funds armies. If you have a lot of gold reserves built up in your country, then other countries are going to think twice about attacking you, because all that gold that you're sitting on can pay for a whole lot of warfare. So mercantilism, what is it? Well, basically, mercantilism is the policy of making sure that you have more gold coming into your country than you have going out of your country. You're accumulating gold. How do you make that happen? Well, basically, at the most basic level, you have to export as much as you can, because you're getting cash for those exports, and you need to import as little as you can. Right? Because when you import, cash leaves your country. So this way, your country is becoming wealthier than everybody else. And colonies, as we shall see, play a big role in mercantilism. So ways to do mercantilism and amass gold in your country. Now, there's 3 levels of sophistication that you can take, and I've got them outlined here, A, B, and C. And we'll start with just the most basic level of sophistication. You can decrease the imports you have and increase the exports, right? Now, this doesn't happen just because you want it to. You have to work at it. You have to make this happen. And that's the lowest level of sophistication when it comes to mercantilism. But let's make this a little more sophisticated. Instead of worrying about decreasing imports and increasing exports, why don't we increase both? We can increase both imports and increase exports, but do this. Increase imports of cheaper things you're paying less cash for, and also increase the export of more expensive things, things that you're selling for cash. See, so you accomplish the same thing in B as you do in A, it's just more sophisticated. But you can reach that brass ring of sophistication and do something truly ingenious, and you can kill two birds with one stone if you do this. What if you can turn the cheap things that you import into the more expensive things that you export? Now you're really rocking. Now you're killing two birds with one stone now. And how do you do that? Skilled processing. So where does all this gold come from in mercantilism? Well, if we go back here, one of the problems that you may see that we run into is this. Where are you going to get these cheap imports from? And where are you going to sell these expensive exports to? Well, the answer is colonies. Ultimately, it comes from making the people that you trade with pay more money to you. Your own people are going to be making so much money off of the increased foreign demand for their manufactured goods that you can get tons of tax revenue from them while still keeping their tax rates relatively low. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, he was the Controller General from 1665 to 1683, and he was a mercantilist stud. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was a financial genius. He believed that a country's wealth and economy should be employed to serve the state. In other words, its wealth and its economy should serve the army, and fund the bureaucracy. And Colbert vigorously applied mercantilism to France. And he chose to practice mercantilism instead of imposing a high tax rate on the people, and instead of selling those new government offices. He thought mercantilism was a much, much better and sounder way of funding the army and funding the bureaucracy and centralizing power. So how does Colbert increase skilled processing? Because like I said, if you're going to reach that most sophisticated level of mercantilism and actually turn your cheap imports into expensive exports, you need skilled processing. So how are you going to increase skilled processing? Well, our textbook tells us this. One of the things that Jean-Baptiste Colbert did was he would subsidize older industries, because it's all about industry. And then Jean-Baptiste Colbert also created new industries. For this to work, your manufactured goods, though, have to be of a quality that is competitive. In other words, the goods that you export, the goods that you turned into expensive stuff from the cheap things that you brought in, they have to be good. They have to be worth it for people to buy. And so Colbert wrote new production regulations to ensure the quality of these products. And he also created new guilds, because guilds actually police quality for you. Jean-Baptiste Colbert encouraged the immigration of new craftsmen into France from the outside. Bringing in these skilled people increased France's ability to do this skilled processing. So how did Jean-Baptiste Colbert decrease the imports of expensive manufactured goods? He did two things. Number one, he abolished domestic tariffs. Tariffs that you had to pay on goods that you were sending from one part of the country to another. Get rid of those. Make it real easy to move and sell goods within the country. Second thing he did was he raised import tariffs. In other words, tariffs on goods that are coming into the country from the outside. Now, how did he increase the import of cheaper things? Raw materials that you can process into expensive things that you can sell. Well, he did a couple of things. He founded the French West India Company, and he also founded the French East India Company to basically pirate Dutch and English trade routes. He also colonized Quebec and Louisiana for their potential for raw materials. Here's an example of a very, very lucrative raw material for France, and that was furs from Canada. So why are colonies important in mercantilism? Well, your colonies are your best supplier of those cheap raw materials like sugar and tobacco and furs and cotton. Not only that, but your colonies are also your best customers for your expensive manufactured goods that you're going to make from those cheap raw materials. You can regulate the industries of your colonies so that they can't produce manufactured goods that compete with your manufactured goods, because the last thing you want to do is create your own competition. Well, Jean-Baptiste Colbert died in 1683. And Louis XIV's military expenses were a huge strain on France and on France's economy by this time. And the situation called for desperate measures. And Colbert's successors did not do so well in funding Louis's government. They did the things that Colbert didn't want to do. They raised taxes. They devalued on purpose France's currency. When you do these two things, it puts a strain on your people. Louis XIV's wars. Louis XIV was in power for 54 years, and he was at war for 33 of those 54 years. Louis viewed himself as a conqueror, and Louis's Secretary of State for War, Francois Letellier, created a professional state army. He standardized weapons and uniforms. He developed a rational system of training and promotion. And this model that he created was followed across Europe. The goal was to expand French territory. Louis XIV expanded to what he considered France's, quote, natural borders. He took territory in Flanders and the Netherlands, 1667 to 1668. He captured Strasbourg in 1681. He took Lorraine in 1684, and then nothing. Louis XIV had reached his limit, the full extent of his military conquest ability. Military expenses strained the French economy in the 1680s and 1690s. Colbert was gone. He was dead. And his successors devalued, in other words, manipulated the French currency. Now, how does devaluating your currency help you pay for your military expenses? Well, here's a better question. Why, in the year 2019 or the year 2020 or 2021, do countries angrily accuse other countries of devaluing their currencies? Let me explain. Devaluing your currency is like ketchup for your entire economy. It's good on everything. When you devalue your currency, the price of your country's products don't change. In other words, $20 for a shirt is still $20 for a shirt. But the currency just got cheaper for other people relative to their own currencies, and their currencies got a little more expensive for your people. So in effect, your $20 shirt just got cheaper for people outside the country because that $20 that's needed to pay for it just got cheaper. So when you devalue your currency, you instantly make all your products across the board, across your entire economy, more attractive for foreigners to buy, and at the very same time, you make their products less attractive for your own people to buy. So you just did a double whammy on everybody else by devaluing your currency. So now you have more jobs because more workers are needed to meet the higher foreign and domestic demand for your products. And you have more tax revenue because you can tax all these people who are earning more money with their fancy new jobs. Louis XIV and the War of Spanish Succession. The French and the Spanish monarchs were now related by intermarriage, and there's a YouTube video to explain that. Louis XIV had been married to Maria Theresa, daughter of the King of Spain, in 1660. And this was part of the 1659 Treaty of the Pyrenees, which ended a 24-year-long war between France and Spain. As part of the Treaty of the Pyrenees, Maria Theresa renounced all claims to Spanish territory for herself and for any of her descendants. That was the deal. And Louis XIV and Maria Theresa had one surviving son, also named Louis, born in 1661, and he was the heir to the French throne. So Louis XIV's son, Louis, grew up and had three sons of his own. He had Louis, born in 1682, Philip, born in 1683, and Charles, born in 1686. And so all three of these are Louis XIV's three grandsons. Well, Louis XIV's son, Louis, was the heir to the throne. In other words, he was the Grand Dauphin, right? Grand Dauphin. And Louis XIV's eldest grandson was the next heir to the French throne, so he was the Petit Dauphin. Neither of these two Louis would actually outlive Louis XIV and become king. Louis XIV would actually live long enough to pass the throne to his great-grandson Louis in 1715. And you can see this picture right here, the little baby right there. That's who he's going to pass his throne on to. The other two, his son and his grandson, they both get bypassed because they die first. And the point of all this is that Louis XIV's only son, Louis, is a direct heir to the French throne. And Louis XIV's eldest grandson was the next heir to the French throne after that. But Louis XIV's second oldest grandson, Philip, he's available. And so in 1665, Maria Theresa's father, Philip IV, died. And her 3-year-old half-brother, Charles II, became King of Spain. And there's a picture of him right there, and you can just look at him and see that he's got problems. Due to 16 generations of inbreeding, Charles II was so unattractive that even his wife was scared of him. And Charles II of Spain was also physically and mentally decrepit and was so deformed that he was barely able to walk or even talk. And there was no way that he was going to produce an heir to the Spanish throne. In addition, Spain itself was also in decline. It could no longer take care of its vast empire. And this empire consisted of holdings in Italy, Spanish Netherlands, the Philippines, the Americas. And so this succession problem made for a huge balance of power crisis for all of Europe. Whatever European power got control of the Spanish throne would inherit enormous resources. You could make a lot of war on a lot of people with those resources. The solution, a treaty. A treaty that would name an heir to the Spanish throne that would be acceptable to all parties involved. A treaty which would divide Spain's empire in a way that was acceptable to all parties involved, including Spain. And the Treaty of The Hague was signed in 1698, but then that fell apart. And then the Treaty of London was signed in 1700, but then that treaty also fell apart. And meanwhile, Charles II, the decrepit King of Spain, decrepit because of all the inbreeding, died. But before he died, Charles II signed off on Spain's own unilateral plan of succession. And in this plan, Spain would keep all of its empire. Spanish throne would go to Louis XIV's second oldest grandson, Philip, also known as Philip of Anjou. This was a clear violation of the Treaty of the Pyrenees, because this could give Louis XIV tremendous influence over the affairs of Spain. Huge, huge balance of power issue. Well, Louis XIV supported the idea of having his own grandson become king of Spain, of course. But it looked all way too cozy to everybody else. If the thrones of France and Spain were ever united, that was going to throw the balance of power completely in France's favor. And so this controversy results in a major conflict, the War of Spanish Succession. So in the end, everybody went to war against France in the War of Spanish Succession, and it lasted from 1701 to 1713. There was a grand alliance formed, and it consisted of the English, Dutch, Austrians, and Prussians, and all of them went to war against Louis XIV. This war lasted 13 years. Somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000 men were killed in action. And part of the War of Spanish Succession was fought in the American colonies, where it was known as Queen Anne's War. The Peace of Utrecht in 1713 finally ended the war, and it preserved the balance of power in Europe. Louis XIV's second oldest grandson, Philip of Anjou, would stay on as King of Spain and become Philip V. But the French and Spanish crowns could never be united according to this treaty, and France and Spain both gave up claims to numerous important foreign territories. This was how the map looked after the Peace of Utrecht was signed in 1715. And you've got an inset there, which also showed the way that the various colonies were disposed. Louis XIV's wars took a huge toll on the French people. They had suffered from high taxes, from disease, food shortages, malnutrition, and war casualties. And Louis XIV finally died in 1715, leaving France on the brink of bankruptcy. In the end, it doesn't really look like Louis XIV gained that much for all the effort and all the sacrifice. The decline of absolutist Spain in the 17th century, as France's fortunes rose under the leadership of people like Colbert in the 17th century, Spain's actually fell. There's a comparison. Let's contrast what Jean-Baptiste Colbert was doing in France with what Spain was either doing or allowing. Spanish colonies. Before 1610, Spain got thousands of tons of silver from those mines in South America. But then, from 1610 to 1650, trade with those colonies fell 60%. Why did trade with the colonies fall? Well, several reasons. Unlike France, Spain allowed its colonies to trade with other countries like England and the Netherlands. In France, the French colonies could only trade with France. That's a cornerstone of mercantilism. You don't let your colonies trade with other countries. And unlike France, Spain allowed its colonies to develop their own manufacturing bases. Another cornerstone of mercantilism is you don't allow your colonies to develop their own manufacturing, because that's going to compete with your home manufacturing. And also, the South American silver mines were starting to run dry. So to raise funds, the Spanish did two things. Number one, they devalued their currency over and over and over again. And we've talked about why that is a very tempting strategy. The other thing they did was they defaulted on their loan payments, declaring bankruptcy. If your credit is bad, nobody wants to loan you more money. So now you have no capital to work with. Spanish manufacturing was shrinking. In France, Jean-Baptiste Colbert was doing everything possible to grow France's manufacturing capacity, right? Because it's that capacity that turns cheap raw materials into expensive goods that you can export. But the opposite was happening in Spain. Why? Well, Spain's productive middle class was tiny because in Spain you were either a noble or a peasant. So nobody was really manufacturing anything. And unlike France, Spain's elite considered business to be beneath their dignity. This might have anti-Semitic roots, and as we know, anti-Semitism is a massive part of Spain's culture. And chasing after money was considered distasteful and maybe even Jewish. Unlike in France, huge numbers of able-bodied, able-minded Spaniards entered economically unproductive professions. For example, there were thousands and thousands of monasteries in Spain. And I like to say this, the monastery ain't monetary. So instead of protecting its tiny manufacturing sector and allowing it to grow and helping it, Spain was letting it suffer from inflation, letting it suffer from competition for colonial and international markets. France's Jean-Baptiste Colbert would do everything possible to discourage trade with rival economies. Colbert would never let French colonies have their own manufacturing sector to compete with the mother country. So instead of inviting skilled workers into the country like France was doing, the Spanish king expelled 300,000 Moriscos from Spain in 1609. These were former Muslims who had converted to Catholicism, and they included many thousands of skilled workers and merchants. Instead of adding new quality standards like Jean-Baptiste Colbert did, the Spanish ignored new technologies and new methods, especially if they came from those heretical sources like the English or the Dutch. I mean, they're not even Catholic. Can't trust them. Spanish agricultural production was also shrinking. Also in this sector, the Spanish ignored new technologies and new methods. Peasants were paying heavy taxes and high rent. Why? Well, to preserve the lifestyle of the nobility. The nobility were literally forcing their own peasant farmers out of farming and out of feeding them. Spanish political power was shrinking. Philip IV's prime minister from 1621 to 1645 was Gaspar de Guzman, the Count Duke of Olivares. And he was no Colbert and he was no Richelieu. He felt that Spain's total solution to all its problems was to return to its imperial traditions, and that meant retaking its lost empire, especially the Netherlands. And he attacked the Dutch Republic, which got Spain into a very serious war with France. Gaspar de Guzman introduced, quote, tax reform to pay for the war effort, but this really translated into making Catalonia and Portugal pay higher taxes. And in 1640, Spain faced political revolts in Catalonia and in Portugal, and the Catalan revolt didn't get resolved until the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659. And Spain actually lost some territory as a result. The Portuguese and the Spanish had been united under one throne ever since 1580, and this situation had been called the Iberian Union. And this revolution that we're seeing here became known as the Portuguese Restoration, and it was sealed in the Treaty of Lisbon in 1668. So again, Spain had to recognize Portuguese independence and the Portuguese crown. Spain's military power was shrinking. Before 1643, Spain's land army dominated Europe. But in 1643, the French defeated Spain at the Battle of Rocroi in Belgium. And that defeat showed that Spanish weapons and Spanish tactics had become obsolete. In 1659, Spain and France signed the Treaty of the Pyrenees, and this ended the Franco-Spanish War that had lasted from 1635 to 1659. This war had begun as part of the 30 Years' War and had continued after the Peace of Westphalia. So the war had lasted 24 years and had cost 300,000 deaths. In the treaty, France gained pieces of Spanish territory.